rapidly replaying these sequences. It's like we talked about how one state defines the next. So when you're repeating something over and over and over and you stop, the nervous system doesn't just switch to what you're doing. It keeps generating that sequence. And when you suddenly limit your motor behavior or your cognitive behavior, so maybe you're reciting lines to remember, and all of a sudden you just stop and you attempt to stop doing that, your mind keeps going and it accelerates the number of repetitions, and then you return to the practice in terms of structuring their training or their learning in a way that it's appropriate levels of difficulty, neither too difficult nor too easy. The other thing that's very clear is that the process of neuroplasticity, as I mentioned, has two steps, major steps. One is focus, and then one is deep rest. Most of the rewiring and learning in your nervous system is going to occur during deep sleep. And so obviously try and get sufficient amount of quality sleep, slow wave and REM sleep, as much as possible. But there are two really nice papers published in the journal Cell Reports, the Cell Press journal, excellent journal, which show that even brief 20-minute periods of resting or napping after a learning bout can greatly accelerate the neuroplasticity process. So whether or not you're trying to learn a new motor skill, whether or not you have just done an intense visualization, which can be relaxing, but it's really a form of training and repetition, whether or not you're learning math or piano or whatever it is, that in some period of time within the immediate 4 hours after the learning bout or the visualization, to get 20 minutes of maybe a shallow nap. You could do what we call non-sleep deep rest. Some people call it yoga nidra. There are other forms of non-sleep deep rest, essentially letting the brain go idle, closing your eyes. They've done, and this is work done in humans. It was done sensory motor learning complex sequences of a kind of a Simon Says game, which is, hitting, some people won't remember what that is, but remembering the sequences of lights, and it can be very easy when there's only 3 or 4 things in that sequence, but as you get up to 20 or 30, that's some serious work. The other thing that really favors neuroplasticity are what are called gap effects. And these date back more than a couple decades, and have been demonstrated in a huge variety of contexts of learning. But anytime you're learning something, it pays to have random intervals in which you stop and do nothing. So let's use learning a sequence of the keys on the piano, just for sake of example. You're practicing a scale or you're practicing a piece of music. Every once in a while, if you have a timer that goes off randomly, or the instructor or teacher tells you stop, and you attempt to do nothing. You could close your eyes or keep them open, but you stop the motor pattern, or you stop trying to do the math problem, or you stop trying to do the physical sequence that you were doing. Turns out that when we sleep, there's a rapid replay of these sequences of events during the day, but at much higher speed. So per unit time, you're getting about 10 to 60 times the replay or repetition of what you're doing during the day. During these brief gaps, these 10-second gaps that are introduced while awake during your learning, you get a 10 to 20 times repeat of whatever sequence you were trying to learn. So this is a way of getting more repetitions in, even though you're doing less. And so these gap effects are fascinating. They're being demonstrated now for more and more types of learning. And fortunately, the more recent papers really point to the neural mechanisms. It's the hippocampus and the neocortex, areas involved in storage and retrieval of memories, that are rapidly replaying these sequences. It's like we talked about how one state defines the next. So when you're repeating something over and over and over and you stop, the nervous system doesn't just switch to what you're doing. It keeps generating that sequence. And when you suddenly limit your motor behavior or your cognitive behavior, so maybe you're reciting lines to remember, and all of a sudden you just stop and you attempt to stop doing that, your mind keeps going and it accelerates the number of repetitions, and then you return to the practice. What can I eat? What can I do in order to enhance my learning? What's going to trigger BDNF release? When in fact, the process of neuroplasticity is built into our childhood and how we developed, for better or for worse, right? Hence the discussion about trauma. But there are a couple elements to neuroplasticity that we now know require focus and then rest. So the number one support for learning is going to be deep sleep, regular deep sleep. So if kids want to learn better, adults want to learn better, that's the thing to focus on first. That's really the anchor to everything. And we know this. And for people that feel anxiety hearing this, realize that you are resilient. You can have a poor night's sleep. I would say try and get great sleep about 80% of the time, but that sleep is really the thing to focus on until it's in place to get everything else to work well. And then after learning, to take a 20-minute nap if you can, or just try and shut off the amount of sensory input coming in. And again, that doesn't have to happen immediately after the learning, but at some period in the next 4 hours after the learning, because we know that recall, persistence of the memory of what you learned, and the ability to execute these motor sequences just goes way, way up.
Yeah.